My name is Laura Gray. I will be our moderator for today. I'm the Director of Education at Drug Free Sport. And we have a great session for you today from our webinar series, Race and Diversity in Sport. And we're going to go ahead and get started. Hopefully everyone can hear me as well. So there we go. So just a little housekeeping as we move forward here. Your screen should look something like this. You'll probably see my screen, my slides up, and just want to orient you to your dashboard for tools where you can log in and obviously call in to hear the audio. And then the question bar, I definitely want to point out first and foremost, because we're going to be using that a lot with our speakers today. They've actually specifically requested that they want to take questions throughout the presentation so that we can have a little bit of dialogue back and forth and really make the most of our time here together. This is also a reminder that today's presentation will be recorded and also provided within 24 hours after today's event. There we go. Oh, and I will also be skipping doing full speaker bio reads just to make the most of our time. We've got some excellent content for you here today, and we want to make sure that you can just download the full speaker bios for everyone just by using the Handouts tab on your GoToWebinar dashboard and panel that you have on the right side of your screen there. A few things for us to note today. It is required for those of you that are BOC certified athletic trainers that you're actively present in the live event and complete the post-webinar survey in order to receive your CEU certificate. The slides from today's presentation will not be shared with attendees after the event per our speaker's request. So really just through the recording and through our live interaction with the speakers today. CEU certifications will be emailed to attendees within 48 hours following today's presentation. I already mentioned today's webinar will be recorded. And then if you have any questions about this or future webinar events, please go ahead and feel free to email me. My email address is shown there, and I'll also provide it at the end of the session today as well. And without further ado, I want to make sure that we turn it over to our speakers. Again, feel free as they start to deliver content to be sure to use the questions bar to either communicate with me or again to address questions that I can pose to any of our speakers. We have Dr. Douglas, Assistant Professor in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis. And all three of our speakers come to us today from the University of Missouri-Columbia. We're also joined with Professor Mike Alden. He's the Associate Teaching Professor in the Department of Educational School and Counseling Psychology, and also the former Athletic Director at University of Missouri-Columbia. Dr. Pat Ivey is the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Access and Leadership Development, also a former professional athlete and the 2013 National Strength Coach of the Year. So without further ado, I'm going to kind of pass the baton here and turn it over to our speakers.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor and a privilege to be with you. My name is Dr. Ty Douglas, and I'm here with my colleagues, as Laura mentioned, Dr. Pat Ivey and Professor Mike Alden. We are excited to share this time with you. Wish that we could see your faces, and we look forward to hearing your voices as we continue in our conversation, a conversation that we've framed around the topic race and diversity in sport. And so we're going to really seek to delve deeper into some of these issues that I believe are very significant to the context of sport and administration today, particularly in today's climate. And so we're excited to be able to share this time with you. Just really quickly, I would like to be able to invite my colleagues to briefly say hello to you so you can hear their voices, and then I'll proceed from there.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Pat Ivey. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. I look forward to sharing my experiences as a former student athlete, professional athlete, coach, administrator, and as a person now working in our Division of Inclusion, Diversity, and equity on our college campus.
And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mike Alden, and I'm an associate teaching professor at the University of Missouri in the College of Education. And I look forward to visiting with you, particularly from my experiences as a director of athletics at the University of Missouri and Division I college athletics for a number of years, and also as the past president of the Association of Directors of Athletics in the country. So I look forward to visiting with you today.
So as you can see, we have a pretty diverse group here, and we're excited about the perspectives and lenses that we bring. I'm also a faculty member of the College of Education, in particular our Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis, where I'm also the program coordinator and have had the opportunity to engage with both Professor Alden and Dr. Ivey in multiple capacities. So I just wanted to highlight one or two things before we start. First of all, we have no conflicts of interest to report. We also want to acknowledge that elements of our presentation today draw on work that was funded by the NCAA Innovations in Research and Practice grant that we earned in 2015. So we want to continue to thank them for their support of this work. Hopefully you've had a chance to take a look at the learning objectives. I won't read through them in their entirety, but I do want to ensure that, just as a reminder, that we really understand that this is a large conversation, a conversation that we are just privileged to participate in, but our goal is not to seek to explain every single thing as relates to identity, race, and sports. Certainly that's not possible. But we do want to highlight some key terms in our presentation. We want to identify, in particular based on the research that we've done, what we've learned about how Black male student athletes form identities and define success. And then we also want to think about how you can critically consider the culture and social context of your organization and the implications for the work that you're doing in your organization. So hopefully if you're listening, you have a pen and a paper in front of you, or you're taking notes, because we want to ask you lots of questions. And in many ways, I'm going to sort of moderate and take specific questions that I believe Dr. Ivey will answer from the perspective of a coach and an administrator, as well as Professor Alden from his perspective as an administrator. And so we hope that you will also continually ask yourself, how does this information apply to your organization? We also want to share with you a few conceptual models that we have developed and competencies that we believe are necessary for leaders in these complex times. So one of the frameworks that I've been developing is a framework that emerges from not just my research, but I've been sharing across the country this notion of doing me search, of asking critical questions of our stories, our journeys, our perspectives, where we come from, and how those experiences shape how we see and perhaps miss particular variables, right? So our identities impact what we see and don't see. And as a result of that, I've also done what we call research. So that is, for me, thinking about not just the research that others have done and not just my own story, but then panning out and thinking about how does those variables connect to the experiences of those that I study and engage with. And that framework has led to a larger context. Here it notes border crossing leader. But more than that, I've really been asking, what does it look like to do free search? You know, what does it look like to engage in freedership, not just leadership, but freedership? And so I wanted to share that with you at the beginning of this call for you to think about what that looks like in your organization. So for me, being born and raised in Bermuda, a small island, 21 square miles at its widest point, 21 square miles long and 1 mile wide at its widest point, space is particularly significant for me and my work. I see space perhaps in a slightly different way, in part because of the shortage of space in Bermuda, right? And so that impacts how I see organizations. But I also want you to think about how we see other emblems and symbols in this country. If you've been following the news, you'll have seen yesterday there was a report of the Confederate flag protests taking place in South Carolina. They're at the NCAA tournament. And so we want you to think about, really quickly, just in maybe 30 seconds, you know, when you see the American flag, what comes to your mind? And if we had the technology capacity, we would have had you to share some of those insights, perhaps so we could have almost done a short survey and to see, but it'll be interesting for you just to think about that. On your piece of paper, just jot down a few terms or thoughts that come to your mind when you see the American flag, and even when you see the Confederate flag. What does that mean to you? Just take maybe 10 seconds, 15 seconds, doesn't have to be anything long, and you don't have to share it. But just take a second to reflect on that for a second for us.
say, for those folks listening, go ahead and use the questions box to respond to our speakers. We can definitely detail and give you a voice in that capacity as well to communicate.
Excellent. Thank you. We'll take about 10 more seconds. Again, what do you see? What are your thoughts when you see the American flag, and also when you see the Confederate flag? What do they mean to you? I'm not suggesting that the two are synonymous or even connected because they're in the same picture, but just as you think about those those emblems separately, what do they mean to you? We'll take about 5 more seconds or so. And the reason we think this is important is because we believe that these are examples of curriculum. That what you see, they send messages. It's more than a flag. It suggests ideologies. It represents histories that can be complex, histories through which one may have different perspectives on. I think that if you're following the news as relates to Colin Kaepernick's protest that over the last season. And looking at the divergence and difference of opinion as relates to his protest, I think it speaks to the complexity of imagery, the complexity of space, the complexity of histories, and how they are perceived, and how they connect to nationalism. As relates to the work that we've done here in our university context, but also in our state, you think back, the state of Missouri has been, if you will, a launch pad for a number of critical movements in this country. In particular, when you think about Ferguson, with the shooting of Mike Brown, as a team, we really began to think about the implications of proximity and perspective and space. And so the word there, prophetic, is there as well, because in many regards, long before the nation was talking about some of these issues as relates to race and sport over the last, 2 or 3 years, we were having these conversations as a team about what does this mean, to be an hour and 45 minutes from Ferguson, Missouri. It was incumbent upon us as leaders, as responsible leaders, to think about what do these realities mean for our student athletes. And so I'm honored to sit in the room and have a conversation today with two gentlemen, two leaders, who were really thoughtful, I believe, about this, and in particular, partnering with Pat Ivey on this study. But really, the study wouldn't have happened without the leadership of Mike Alden and him actually allowing us to commission this study. And so I guess it'd be a great place to maybe even just sort of invite my colleagues into the conversation from a leadership standpoint. When we think about the context, whether it be geographically and our proximity to Ferguson, but also even commission the study. Perhaps there's an administrator who's listening, who's wondering how and why would we even engage in this work, and maybe your thought process as relates to being open to us, beginning to ask these questions. Any thoughts, gentlemen?
Let me make a comment. This is Mike Alden again, and I'll speak from a perspective of an administrative capacity on a college, campus and an athletic program, at least from my perspective. I think, knowing the environment that we should be in, which is certainly an opportunity for us to be able to learn, to be able to express ourselves, to be in a respectful area, and to be able to grow every day, and to be able to have an understanding and an appreciation from people that we work with each and every day. It's incumbent upon us to be able to be proactive in our efforts, to be able to try to learn as much as we possibly can every day about influences to our student athletes, influences to our staff, the type of impact our program or our areas can make on other areas on our campus, throughout our community, and throughout our state, and maybe even our country. And so in doing that, I think it's critically important that we recognize that it's a responsibility that we have, and that's the way we took that from our perspective here at Mizzou. It was a responsibility that we had in order to be able to open ourselves up, to be able to look at who we are, and to do similar to what Dr. Douglas is talking about. As much about research, this was about me search, and the me search had to do with this is who we need to find out who we are as Mizzou Athletics. I don't know, Pat, what do you think?
Absolutely. I think about the interactions that, as a coach, that you have with the athletes on a daily basis, and the impacts that you want to make on them, not just as student athletes, but as people. And when you're trying to be the best you can be and you're striving for excellence, then you have to understand that it's not just about the product on the field or on the court or the pool or wherever it may be, but it's about the holistic development of the person. So if you're talking about social responsibility or competitive excellence or academic integrity, when you want to instill these values in your student athletes and you want that to live in your athletics department, it's important that you see the person. It's important that you see the person underneath the helmet or the whatever they're wearing on their head. There's a person there that needs to be developed so that you can have you can help them to maximize their potential.
Sure. Appreciate you sharing that. And I think that, we think about the complexity of history or his story, right? We're talking about stories. We're talking about narratives. But also as we transition, and we want to show you a brief clip. It's very short, but I think it's something that gives us just a little bit of context as it relates to history and perhaps why even certain images have differing effects on people based on what they know about them or how they see them. We really want you today to think about the mission of your organization. So if you are serving, in a college athletic program, typically you have a mission that talks about, as Dr. Ivey mentioned, the holistic development of students. So when we think about the why of this conversation, in order to holistically develop someone, we have to understand who they are and the identities that they bring. And those identities are grounded in histories, personal and collective. And so as we're sharing today, and as you watch this short clip, please consider what this means for not just your personal history, your own sort of understandings of your own research and your own leadership, but also think about the histories and perspectives of those you lead and serve, and even those who are in your community who may see these things slightly differently. And then finally for us, and before we watch the clip, we really want you to think it's important for us to critically reflect on these issues before the cameras come, before a reporter asks your thoughts on these issues. We believe that the research and the research needs to happen now. And that's why we believe this conversation is important. In the work that we do to actually prepare and have these conversations in my classroom, for example, and even what we did with some of our leadership team members in some of the Men for Men and conversations with other administrators on our campus, we took a lot of time to process and to look at resources. And one of the resources that we looked at was a film called Race the Power of an Illusion. That's illusion with an I. It's a three-part series, but the third part of the series is called The House We Live In. It's a dynamic and powerful film. We want to share with you a short excerpt from it. Please take any notes and ask any questions that you may have about it, but think about how this connects to perceptions of history, and hopefully you can hear this well. Laura, please let us know if you have any challenges hearing it, and we'll do our best to modify the sound on this side. Thank you.
Thousands of GIs came home ready to start families, but had no place to live. In the 1930s, the federal government created the Federal Housing Administration, whose job it was to provide loans or the backing for loans to average Americans so they could purchase a home. Federal programs and banks sank millions into the home construction industry. Their message to veterans: you can afford a new home. Buy a new home now. Tax dollars help make the single-family home a mass-produced consumer item. The American dream had a new name: suburbia.
We came to Levittown and we found the model house, and we walked in and we looked around, and of course in the eyes of a young man man who was raised in the ghetto, so to speak, it was an interesting experience, interesting lifestyle, seeing all the new modern conveniences. Very fascinating.
Eugene Burnett came home with almost 1 million other black GIs. They had fought for the country in segregated ranks. They returned hoping for equality and the American dream. For many, that dream was a new home for little money down and some of the easiest credit terms in history.
I went up to the salesman. We're interested in your home. We're interested in buying one. And what is the procedure? Is there an application to be filled out? So forth. So he looked at me, looked around, and he said to me, he says, listen, it's not me, but the owners of this development have not as yet decided to sell these homes to Negroes.
The FHA underwriters warned that the presence of even 1 or 2 non-white families could undermine real estate values in the new suburbs. These government guidelines were widely adopted by private industry. Race had long played a role in local real estate practices. Starting in the 1930s, government officials institutionalized the national appraisal system, where race was as much a factor in real estate assessment as the condition of the property. Using this scheme, federal investigators evaluated 239 cities across the country for financial risk.
So that those communities that were all white, suburban, and far away from minority areas, they received the highest rating, and that was the color green. Those communities that were all minority or in the process of changing, they got the lowest rating, and the color red. They were redlined. As a consequence, most of the mortgages went to suburbanizing America, and it suburbanized it racially.
As homes in white communities appreciated in value, the net worth of these white families grew. For most non-white families who stayed in urban neighborhoods, the housing market opened to them in the 50s and 60s was largely a rental market. You don't gain equity by paying rent.
Where one family lives in America is not just a matter of taste and preference. You have the issue of housing and wealth. The majority of Americans hold most of their wealth in the form of home equity. So that's their nest egg. That's how they can finance the education of their offspring. That's how they can sort of save up for retirement. It's their savings bank, right? They're living in their savings bank.
My family, like a lot of families in Detroit, struggling to buy a house. You had a dual housing market, one white, one black. A housing market with one with a lot of demand, another housing market with very little demand. My father lives in the house that I grew up in. The house today, 5-bedroom house, is worth about $20,000. That same house bought in the suburbs would be worth today about $320,000. So whites moving to the suburbs were being subsidized in the accumulation of wealth, while blacks were being divested.
And these were public policy decisions in which, on one hand, people were given access to property, given title, and subsequently wealth. And on another hand, where people were not given access to property, did not generate wealth, and did not generate the kind of opportunity for the next generation.
So I want you to just take a few minutes just to process your thoughts, and we'll transition. But we wanted to share that with you because we believe that the conversations that we're having nationally are connected to perceptions and perspectives on history. And so even a clip like that gives some additional context as relates to federal policies and how they have impacted history and also today. So we want you to give that some thought. As we engage now in thinking about how the context, how geography and space impacted our own institution, we want to model a bit of that for you now. We began to ask different questions about our own athletic context. And in particular, we looked at our Academic All-American board, a board that did not have any people of color on, any black or brown individuals on the board. And for me, as a person who studied space, I walked into the facility and it was obvious to me. And I was wrestling with, did anyone else see it? And I wanted to know, what did this mean for others? Did others see it? What did it mean for our student athletes, particularly when juxtaposed to other imagery like this one, where we see images of successful, in particular, black males on the boards, on the bulletin boards. And I wondered, what did that mean for the trajectories and definitions of success, and also the goals and majors that a young man, particularly African-American young man, would choose when he comes into our facility and sees curriculum. All right, so I want you to think about the boards in our buildings as curriculum, not just as arbitrary, sort of bulletin board material, but think about the curriculum in your building. All right, think about the culture of your building. What do people see on the boards, and maybe what are the different perspectives that people may have about the very same material? I think that's something important for us to consider. We're going to move quickly through these pieces. This is some context of what, if you look at just some of the highlighted pieces, there are tensions, right, as it relates to the experiences of when we think about the underrepresentation of black males on our college campuses, the overrepresentation of black males in our penal system, and many of the other things that research has found. But when you connect now these results or these realities and think about the historical context, some of which you even just saw in that film, it's a lot more complex than just people making individual bad decisions. We want you to think about systems and structures. We want you to think about the reality that race is a social construct that impacts how history and identities have been experienced and framed, okay? I want to move just a few key terms. In the work that we do, I found this definition of racism to be very helpful. It's race prejudice plus social and institutional power. If you think about that, right, we all have prejudices, but how are those prejudices supported by institutions? All right. So, for example, the policies from the 1930s that were reinforced, right, by national appraisal of systems. These are policies. These are dynamics that reinforce prejudice. So we want you to think about that, okay, as a definition of racism, and not just people not using pejorative remarks to describe a person. All right. Also, the definition of culture is an important one. The totality of thought and practice by which a person or people creates itself, celebrates, sustains, and develops itself, and introduces itself to history and humanity. Thinking about culture. We also want you to think about your epistemology. It's a fancy word, but it just basically means your ways of knowing, your ways of thinking about things, right? That's been influenced by your experiences and the spaces that you've been a part of. Harry Edwards shares a very interesting quotation that's up on the board here. And in short, what he's sharing with us is that black student athletes, they must contend with multiple variables as relates to, and stereotypes as relates to their identities and their supposed abilities, right? And I think this is something for us to think about when we talk about not just history, but also contemporary expectations, and how that also connects with the imagery that you may see in your facilities. Okay, so give that some thought. I will read the quote in the interest of time, but certainly you can see it there, and we'll be happy to follow up with you if you have any additional questions about that. So the study that we engaged in, we looked at how do our black male student athletes form identities and define success, and then how do the histories of black male student athletes contribute to the identities, decisions, and leadership while at LU, and that's a pseudonym. Okay, we interviewed 52 black male student athletes, and we spent time with our young men across a number of sports, so 4 basketball players, 1 baseball player, 45 football players, and 2 track and field athletes. This is a conceptual framework that we use to think about these issues. I won't go into that at this time, but I do want you to know that that when we were thinking about these issues, we were thinking about the capacity for our young man to cross borders. What does it look like for an African-American young man who acknowledged in our study, many of whom acknowledged in our study that they had never spent any significant time with a white person before, for example, and dealing with issues of trust, and how do I engage? How do we help our young man to border cross into a space that's different from where they've been raised? And so we thought about this notion of border crossing as a powerful motif for us to consider the capacity of individuals to experience success in multiple spaces, okay? So we want to introduce some of the voices of our student athletes, and really I want to introduce the voices also of my colleagues around some of the experiences of our student athletes. One of the things that we heard in the study was the reality that, you know, coming into a space like this, they were dealing with a lot of pressure. Pressure was a very significant variable. You know, pressure to succeed on the field. Many of them are first generation college students. Pressure of providing for families, many of whom were struggling financially, and what that looked like as far as even finding ways to handle the pressure. From your perspectives as coaches, as administrators, gentlemen, how is this study, how is this information even helpful in thinking about how to better serve your student athletes, and even how did you maybe address the pressures that they navigated, like when you were in your capacity engaging with them on a daily basis? What did that look like for you all?
Well, for me, as a coach, something that's vital is the importance of motivation, and athletes' motivation, whether it's intrinsic or extrinsic, internal, external, whatever their motivations may be. You just want them to be motivated. But there are things that have a negative impact on motivation. Okay? The drive that an athlete has,
sure.
the drive, the impact on the mental resilience and the mental toughness.
Okay.
When there are other things, when there are other things that can be distracting,
sure.
can be a hindrance to performance, whether that's in life, in the classroom, or in competition. We want to make sure, as coaches, we want to make sure that when our athletes show up and it's time for practice, that they're focused. We want them to be focused in practice. We want them to practice being focused. But there are extenuating circumstances at times, and life happens, as we say sometimes. Life happens, and when those situations in life happens, becomes distractions, then it has a negative impact on performance, and performance reaches across many different areas.
Sure. And the study itself continues to, I think, open our eyes to being able to educate ourselves on the varied experiences that many of us have never had. For example, I've not had this experience, and I'll give you one as an example. So one of our student athletes is a great young kid, failed a drug test. And when that happens at Mizzou, as it does at many schools, but in our particular place, that student athlete is scheduled to meet with me. They meet with me, and they meet with the head of sports medicine, and they also meet with the head coach. And I recall this conversation vividly because as we got together and I was talking to our student athlete, who I knew very well, I said, you got to understand, man, we know that this is inappropriate, right? You know that marijuana or weed is not legal, and you tested positive for it. Here's the case. Now, here's what we got to do. One of the things that we do is not only you're going to have some discipline that goes along with this, but we're going to call your parent or your guardian. We're going to make that telephone call. And that's going to take place because you need to explain this to them. Now, here's what really opened my eyes. This is several years ago. Mr. Alden, I get it, and I understand it, but you got to understand where I come from. When you go home, Mr. Alden, and your dad may have been having a beer, when I go home, my dad may be smoking weed. I mean, I'm just telling you. So I understand what you're saying, Mr. Alden. I absolutely accept, my responsibility that goes along with this. But maybe you can have a little bit better understanding of the context of where I'm coming from, which may be different than the environment that you're coming from. And if you think about that, for me, in the role that I'm at as a director of athletics, to learn from my student athlete, not mine, our student athlete, sure, who taught me something that really meant a lot to me because it opened my eyes to something, that in itself is what this study was intended to do.
Sure. I'm glad you raised that. One of the most poignant lines in the study was a gentleman who mentioned how, his use of marijuana was a shortcut to serenity, and that's a quote unquote. I thought that was just an absolutely powerful description of a person who was dealing with pressure from school and hopes of a professional career, etc. And he mentioned how just the struggle of not trying to take a shortcut to serenity. So we want you to think about that in your own spaces, right? And the tensions that even exist around the images that student athletes see, for example, in our athletic spaces, right? So the don't drink and drive, but there's lots of advertisements that promote alcohol and et cetera. And so just the ways that people seek to find peace, I think, was something powerful that emerged in the study. And to your point, the exposure that many of them have in some of the neighborhood contexts from which they come, it's a different world at times. And so I think that's something important for us to think about when we think about the expectations that our student athletes have, that different family dynamics, neighborhood dynamics, but also the expectations that we have for our student athletes and what the imagery again suggests about those expectations. So let me go back to the Academic All-American Board again. In our study, one of the things that we did was we started the study out by walking each gentleman around our athletic facility and asking them, what do they see? What does it mean to you? So then we walk across the image of a wide receiver who's now in the NFL. They would say something, and we walk across another image of someone else. And then when we came to the Academic All-American Board, there was often a silence or a look of sort of do you see what I see what you see? I've observed that too. And then we began to process and we asked, why is that the case from your perspective? And a lot of different answers emerged. One of the things that I think is most important for our conversation today is many of the young men did not know what it took to be an academic All-American. And when we share with them that you just need to have a 3.3 GPA and to be a starter or a significant bench player, they were like, "What? That's it? I could have done that, right?" But when we talk about expectations, as obviously, if any of the institutions are anything like ours, most student athletes come in believing that they will make it professionally, and we know the numbers don't support that. That most people have that experience. Yet and still, most of our student athletes do not come in believing that they can be an academic All-American. And so when we think about even their schooling experiences prior to coming here, when you think about, let's connect the dots now, when you think about the video that you just saw as relates to the housing market, that schools are funded based on the taxes on houses. So when you think about even the different qualities of schools that student athletes come from and the divergence of resources in different neighborhoods, right? It speaks to the connections between identity and history. And I think that's one of the most important things that we can share with you today from the study. In addition, some of the findings that emerged were, I mentioned the experiences and experimentation, and many of them, had positive experiences and experimentation, but obviously there were some who had some negative experiences and experimented with things that made it more difficult for them to make good decisions in their institutional settings. Exposure, again, whether it be exposure to opportunities, to academic support or academic goals, exposure, even to white communities. Some of them, depending on where they came from, they said, well, I did get a chance to engage with someone who was white and had a good relationship with that person, and sometimes they didn't. And so there was some of the gentlemen who talked about, coming and the parents sort of coaching them up to say, this is how you would have a conversation with a white person, right? So when we talk about border crossing, these are perhaps things that we may not always think about, and also the expression of the identities. Coach Ivey, I want to ask you this question. One of the gentlemen in the study talked about how, and some of the things that we talked about in the study were even relationships. And one gentleman talked about how, run onto the field. He was in an interracial relationship, and his girlfriend was white. And he mentioned that, he knew that his girlfriend's father did not want to meet him because he was black. And and how, amidst, running out onto a field with, 60, 70, 80,000 people shouting and cheering, the thought that he had was, that season ticket holder who doesn't want to meet me, I'm going to show him. But when I think about from a performance standpoint and mental performance and the like, I mean, there's tensions, right? I mean, under helmets and headsets of how this stuff relates not just to the classroom, but also to the field. What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. That's what we call a distraction. Something that takes away from your focus on your performance.
Yeah.
And if you're thinking about what's going on with your relationship and the people who are or not in the stands, that's a distraction.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we won't go into the second piece, but suffice to say, the study is rich. We've talked about the piece of forming identities, but now our work has pushed us to think about how do we help our student athletes flourish. And to be clear, the work from the study transcends race, and I believe that these are things that can be helpful to all of our student athletes across various racial and cultural and ethnic backgrounds, as well as across gender.
Dr. Douglas?
Yes, ma'am.
This is Laura. Before you transition, we had a question come in from Sherry. And Sherry's question is wondering if your research has shown a difference between male and female athletes in regards to racial discrimination.
Yeah, so unfortunately, we haven't had the opportunity to interview our female student athletes yet, Sherry. Thank you for your question. So we cannot speak to that based on research findings. But we do believe that as it relates to the experiences, the racialized experiences on campus, that there are similarities, but we're not able to speak to that definitively without having conducted the research and heard the voices of the women as of yet. But this is an ongoing project, so our goal and hope is to continue to do this work so we can hear multiple voices of our student demographics.
I can speak. This is Pat Ivey. I can't speak anecdotally on behalf of our Black female student athletes. Because there's, when you talk about role models, our Black male and female student athletes, we know that role modeling is the strongest form of how people learn. We know that from the science tells us that it's very strong, and having the types of role models that work with the student athletes, not just the people that serve in roles as custodians or people that work as cooks, but people that are in leadership positions or people that you bring in as consultants, the coaches, the administrators. When you have the type of role models that the student athletes look at and can identify with as someone that looks like them, that we know that affects their trajectory. We know that affects their vision and their focus. We know that if they can, if you take the recent movie Hidden Figures, that was a powerful film, and the impact that it's going to have on women and people of color is that going in STEM-related fields is an option. It is a possibility because I saw it. And not just that we have to have people in person as role models, but who we have on the screen, who we have on television, in roles of success outside of the traditional roles. We know that has a positive impact. What we know also is when you don't have those role models, and the proximity of the athletes, we know that there's a deficit there.
Yeah. So we want to leave time for questions, but we do want to just sort of just give you I guess a snippet of okay, now what, right? Because we're sort of demonstrating aspects of a particular problem or the context of it. But we, from this study, have been able to now develop models that we believe are vital for the work going forward. And I think one of the things that's vital to ask your team, I wanted to skip forward, is, when you think about your team currently, do you have people who have both the skill and the will to do this work, right? One of the things that we think is vital is that you will have the right people in the room to ask critical questions. It's not, this is, each context is different. I'm sure we have folks on this call from various athletic contexts and positions. So, you have to contextualize the information for your space. But I think one of the first questions you have to ask is, do you have the right people in the room, in your building, to be able to even see certain things, right? George Orwell says to see what's in front of our noses takes constant effort. And so there are some things that one person may see easily that another may not. So think about, do you have someone with the skill and the real? Or perhaps you have people with the real, but they lack the skill. All right, and so that you can work with that person. Perhaps you can get the right resource into your building. Perhaps you can utilize some of the services and work that we've been doing, or others, to help your team to get stronger in some of the areas that we've discussed. But then some of it, you may be in a space where you have someone who does not have the real, but they have untapped or unknown skill, right? And this is, just to be clear, this isn't work that is just for a person of color to do. We need leaders and administrators across various identity markers to be willing and committed to this work. And I love what Dr. Ivey mentioned about the role modeling piece. I think that's important. I like to call it, walking counter narratives. It's easier to tell a young man that you can have a PhD and have been a professional athlete and be a strength and conditioning coach and an administrator when a Dr. Pat Ivey is in the building and he is an embodiment of that, right? And so do you have walking counter narratives in your building that demonstrate tangibly, the hopes and dreams and possibilities of what these young men and young women can be? I think that's vital. Now, if you have someone in your building who has no skill and lack the will, then perhaps they don't need to be on your staff. So I think that's something for you to think about. I want to just share with you this piece here, and this is meaty. We don't have time to get into it, but I do want to just whet your appetite a little bit with what we've developed as part of this PACT, which we believe is a comprehensive approach to thinking about these issues critically in your buildings. But in particular, it allowed us to ask, what would it look like if we engaged in sort of whether be formal or informal audits of our spaces, right? To be able to think about the climate and context of your city or your county, or the building that you occupy, right? When you think about a communication or conversation audit, do you have, again, the right people in the room? On your leadership team, does everyone look the same, right? Do you have perspectives of people who can say, well, that feels different, or that's different from me based on my experience, or I can, how are you able to identify blind spots, right? And in order to do that, you have to have the right people, the right lenses in the rooms. What would it look like for you to analyze the curriculum of your buildings, the classes that they select, the images on your walls? What does it look like to think about a character audit or a care audit? Do they feel cared for in your space? Do they feel accepted and valued in your building? Does the building speak and say, we want you here beyond what you can do on the field? Career development audit, right? When you think about the majors that your student athletes select, what majors do they choose and why? Okay, or a coaching audit, right? What methods, what means, what mentalities, what methodologies are reflected in your coaching staff? And we think about here, some of the positive coaching work that's being done. There have been strides made that I think speak to the possibilities of an audit, but also programmatic approaches that are healthy. Think about a chaplaincy audit, right? And a lot of these young men come from backgrounds of faith. Do they also have faith leaders in those spaces that allow them to connect culturally? And then we like to ask the question, the cost audit. What's the cost to you of not doing this work? How much would it cost, you or your organization to not do the work? I think is a vital question for consideration. So I know we've said a mouthful, and I'm sure you have lots of questions for us. We'd love to have the opportunity to follow up with you in whatever capacity you would like to do that. But I'd like to turn it over to Laura and any other questions that may want to come in from our listeners.
Great, yeah, thank you. I think this is a great slide to end on for sure. It gives our listeners a lot to think about. For those of you that either haven't found the question box or have just had that question pop up in your mind here, go ahead and type that into the question bar. I'm just going to take a moment here in our last couple of minutes as those questions come in to make a few announcements. We always get questions about what webinars are coming up or other educational activities, whether it's related to today's topic, race and diversity in sport and how you can learn more, or additional topics related to the work that we do to support the team behind the team here at Drug Free Sport. So you can see a number of our free educational resources and programs here, as well as the websites if you are not currently signed up for certain listservs to receive these publications or receive updates about webinars. We currently do not have another webinar scheduled at this time, but we'll do so, and you can find updates here on drug education programs on the Drug Free Sport website. We also have customized education programs and services, and actually our speakers today came right out of our Sport Exchange Summit, which is a multidisciplinary conference that we host every other year. And I know I didn't mention at the beginning, but Dr. Douglas brought down the house as our keynote speaker and received a large standing ovation from our first event. And so we knew that we wanted him to come back with his colleagues to share all the important work that they've been doing and continue to do so. So if any of these offerings look interesting or you'd like to continue the conversation, again, my email address is there. But we've got time for one last question that came in from Jean. And Jean's question is, are there any recommended readings, books or websites that you would recommend on race and culture in sport for ongoing learning? Which is a great question to end on.
Well, let me respond, and I think Pat and Dr. Douglas, or Dr. Ivey and Dr. Douglas will respond as well too. This is Mike Alden again, and I'm going to get to that answer. This won't take long here, Laura, but I want to tell, at least make this comment for all of us that are online. Not everyone in here on this call are necessarily the CEO of the organization. We get that. We understand that. But I think from a leadership standpoint, regardless of what our position is, regardless of what our title is, we can absolutely make a positive impact on these things that we're discussing today with regards to our to the environment and the space that we're in. We have to make sure we approach this to have intentionality and commitment to this, right? Intentionality and commitment versus obligation and adherence, right? You're going to hear people always talk about we're obligated to do certain things, but we need to be intentional on what we're trying to do. And for our role, it's our role to be able to manage up. It's our role to be able to try to make an impact, to learn as much as we possibly can about the opportunities that exist with our student athletes and with those people that we work with. So my suggestion to you is, first of all, take a look at yourself. Look at yourself. Each one of us has to do that me search that Dr. Douglas talked about. And then when we go beyond that, we have to do our we search. And we search really are those people that we influence. Who are we around, right? That could be student workers that work with us. Those could be student athletes that are part of our team. Those could be direct reports. Those could be people that we actually report to. And then finally, how do we influence beyond that? How do we manage up? But for me, from a knowledge-based standpoint recently, some of the things that I've read that I really have impacted me. I believe her name is Martha Alexander, wrote a book called The New Jim Crow, which was amazingly insightful to me to be able to learn about things that we're experiencing in our country. And then I went beyond that and read a book by Benjamin Watson called Under Our Skin, and he is currently an NFL player for the Baltimore Ravens. He played with the New Orleans Saints, and he was a heck of a player for the University of Georgia as well before that too. But some of the stories that he talks about looking at ourselves and how we impact not only a locker room but an organization and beyond that a community. Those are a couple of readings that I found to be very, very helpful to me.
Yeah, for me, the book Winning Kids with Sport by Dr. Rick McGuire is a very impactful book. I had a chance to contribute one of the chapters to that book, and it helps with identifying what's your why, and then how to execute your why. So as a teacher, as a coach, as an administrator, what's your why, and how you can impact that. As I'm listening to Mike, I'm thinking about three things. How do you acknowledge that there are things that we need to learn? So how do we acknowledge what needs to be learned? Having a growth mindset, a book by Carol Dweck. How do we acknowledge what we need to learn? How do we ask for help? and then how do we take action? So how do we acknowledge? How do we ask for help? And action. How do we move forward?
Yeah, that's awesome. And I would just add, there are a number of resources out there. I think one of these we have to remember is that, a black student athlete or a black athlete is a black person first, and this is part of a larger black family, right? And so I think any resource that will help us to better understand the history and contemporary realities of life in this country are vital. So I want to push us to think beyond sport and how we may, as sports leaders, have to apply the information in this context. That said, there are resources that I think are out there that could be helpful. There's a new book actually by a few of my colleagues, Robert Bennett and James Moore, David Graham, and Samuel Hodge, that's entitled Black Males and Intercollegiate Athletes, an Exploration of Problems and Solutions. It has a number of edited chapters in there. That will be one I'll recommend that's relatively new. And then Dr. Leonard Moore at UT Austin, they do an annual conference or summit every January where they bring together thought leaders and administrators who I think will be, that could be a great space for those who are listening. One of the things I'm excited also to share, a recent project of mine called Border Crossing Brothers, Black Males Navigating Race, Place, and Complex Space. And it speaks to a lot of the things that you've heard in today's conversation, but it also connects it to a larger diasporic conversation. So the athlete experience in Bermuda, and in a month and a half or so, I plan to be in South Africa, where we'll get a chance to replicate the study for a third time to hear about the experience of student athletes there. So I think that our book could be a great resource as well for thinking about these issues spatially and how that intersects certainly with athletics, but how it also transcends to preparing all people for life outside of the sports arena. So thank you again for the opportunity to be a part of this conversation. Wish that we could see your faces and hear your voices. We all like to engage with people, so this is a bit tough to just speak into a vacuum, but we know you're out there, and hopefully the information that's been shared today has been helpful in your work going forward.
Wonderful. Yes, thank you so much to the three of you for joining us today, for your time and collecting your thoughts and sharing them with our audience today. I'm sure that there may be some follow-up questions, and I'll try and direct them as best I can to each of you. But thank you, everybody, for joining us, and I wish everybody a happy and healthy today.